Hi, I'm Coach Corey Wayne, and this is my video coaching newsletter. And the topic of today's newsletter is going to be the Electoral College. Well, ever since the election a couple months ago, I've had a ton of comments and a lot of emails, people asking me, it's because at least half my audience is overseas based, and they want to know what the hell is Electoral College, and how is it that Donald Trump won the presidency if he didn't win the popular vote? So I got a quote that I wrote on this topic, and then I'm going to go through some bullet points and explain that because it's something that is good for all of us to know. And there's a great quote by our former president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and for those of you who don't know who he was a supreme Allied commander of all the Allied forces that were fighting the Nazis during World War II. And after the war, he ran and became president, served 2 terms. Basically, the 1950s, he was the president before JFK, John F. Kennedy. And to me, because I've been studying history since I was a kid, I've always been fascinated by it. And obviously, especially studying warfare, coming from a military family I got generations of members of my family serving in the military going back over 100 years. And he was a great president because he was a great, competent manager and leader. The troops loved him and they loved fighting for him, and he did a great fucking job. And for the most part, ever since then, we've had presidents that are somewhat good, but just a string, especially over the last 20, 25 years, we've just had one incompetent president after another who really wasn't a very good manager. They may have been nice and inspiring people, but at the end of the day, they weren't good at hiring, recognizing, and putting the right kind of talent to run the government. And one of the quotes that Eisenhower said was, and I think this is so important because so many people just don't give a fuck. They think, I'm busy, I don't have time. But it's important, especially if you live in a democratic constitutional republic, like obviously the United States of America is. He said politics should be the part-time profession of every citizen. I mean, how can you be an informed voter if you just never pay attention to the process? So the quote that I wrote regarding this topic that we're going to discuss is, the United States of America is not a democracy. A democracy is mob rule. Whatever the majority wants, they get. Historically, 100% of all democracies have devolved into tyrannical governments. The founding fathers of the USA studied history and looked at what worked and what didn't work, and what led to tyranny. Concentrating too much power in a small group of rulers caused tyranny 100% of the time historically. I mean, all you got to do is look at Venezuela right now. Anybody who thinks socialism is great, I mean, look at the extreme of socialism, or even look at Nazi Germany. I mean, the Nazi Party was a socialist party. And what happened there? You concentrated too much power in the hands of a small group of people, in that case, eventually a dictator. The United States of America is a democratic constitutional republic. It is a union of 50 individual countries with their own governors, which are essentially the leader and the president of each country, and their own state Congress. An electoral college and not a majority of voters elect the president of the United States of America. Each state is allocated electoral voters equal to the number of members of its congressional delegation, 1 for each member of the House of Representatives and 1 for each senator. Electoral voters are mandated to vote according to how their individual states' voters vote in the presidential elections. And obviously, if you were paying attention to current events, there were a few of them that did not vote as they were mandated to, and I think the fine is like $1,000. This helps to prevent highly populous states like California or New York from imposing their will on the entire country. The freedom of the individual is paramount, primary, and supreme, and takes precedence over the collective opinion. As per the Constitution, all rights are God-given natural rights based upon natural law, not from the state or man. The Constitution is written legal evidence of this truth and natural law. Again, just like Eisenhower said, politics should be the part-time profession of every citizen. So I've got some bullet points that I want to go through, but the gist of the quote is what the Founding Fathers did was to try to spread as much of governing power to get it away from the federal government and spread it amongst the states. It even says in the Constitution that unless a power is given directly to the federal government in the Constitution, it is reserved for the states. Because when they studied governments, historically, you look at the fall of Rome, what happens over time is more and more concentration of power into a smaller and smaller group of elite, if you will, and it always leads to tyranny. So, bullet point number 1, the Electoral College is a process, it's not a place. And there'll be links if you want to go to my website, understandingrelationships.com, and look up the article. You can Google understandingrelationships.com, the Electoral College, and that article will come up if you want to follow along to the bullet points and also see the links to the references. These come directly, this is actually a direct quote from the federal government, which you can read online, and I'll have those links on the actual article on my website. The Founding Fathers established it in the Constitution as a compromise between election of the President by a vote in Congress and election of the President by a popular vote of qualified citizens. Currently, the Electoral College consists of 538 electors. A majority of 270 of electoral voters is required to elect the President. Your state's entitled allotment of electors equals the number of members in its congressional delegation. One for each member in the House of Representatives, plus 2 for your senators. In our country, there are 2 senators from each state that serve in Washington, D.C. as part of the federal government. And what you see is also each state has their own legislature consisting of Congress and a state Senate. And the whole idea with the federal government was the union of 50 countries, the federal government would represent the interests of the countries when dealing with other foreign governments and foreign countries. And the business of running the actual states and doing the things that the states needed was reserved for the states themselves. Because, I mean, think about it. Wherever you live, people locally understand what they need versus some bureaucrat that's a couple thousand miles away that's never here. Again, the idea is to spread the governing power amongst the states. So the presidential election obviously is held on November 8th, and the Electoral College votes, and this is a direct quote from the government website, the meeting of the electors takes place on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December after the presidential election. Each state's electoral votes are counted in a joint session of Congress on the 6th of January in the year following the meeting of the electors. So the election was in November. You had the Electoral College meeting, and then obviously on January 6th, it basically gets certified. Members of the House and Senate meet in the House chamber to conduct the official tally of electoral votes. And for those of you that haven't ever been to Washington, D.C., and I had a member of my family who used to work in the lobbying industry, and so I got to go and see all the back alleys, the train and stuff that's underground that the senators and the congressmen get to take. And what's interesting is when you ever see Congress meeting on TV, especially like State of the Union address, it looks huge. But when you're actually there, it's a really tiny room. That was one of the things that was really shocking about going to Washington, D.C. and actually going in the House and Senate chambers, how small they were. So the president-elect takes the oath of office and is sworn in as president of the United States on January 20th in the year following the presidential election. So if you look at like most of Europe, where you have, in essence, social democracies, where you don't have a president, you have members of parliament, And what's different is the members of parliament get together and they typically form factions based on voting blocks to get a certain number of majority to support an individual person from the parliament to be the prime minister of the individual countries by forming coalitions, if you will. So if you look at the individual countries of America, I mean, you look at a country like, I live in Florida, obviously, but you look at California, Florida, or Texas, like California and Florida as well, are great for growing crops and raising cattle and different animals that we all use for food. But based upon if you look at, like, especially around the 1700s, early 1800s, you had to have decent weather in order to grow your crops. So obviously any place that's going to be kind of warmer weather, traditionally back then people are going to tend to have larger populous areas where agriculturally it was, a lot of people back then had to have their own farms and grow their own food and raise their own cattle and have horses and stuff in order to survive. And obviously nowadays with industrialized farming, if you will, and if you've been following the advances in it, we're at the point now where we're literally growing animal flesh, we're growing animal cells in dishes. I think it was about 2 years ago, he had one of the scientists that's working on that, basically grew hamburger meat, if you will, and he put seasoning on it and they cooked it. And you can actually see the videos on the internet, but if you look at that, where are we going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the road? Especially if you've been following like vertical farming or anything like that, where you're literally going to have, you can have warehouses in your individual city that are growing all the food that you need through vertical farming, and eventually we won't need to be mass producing and killing and slaughtering animals by the millions every year. We'll just grow the stuff in essence in warehouses. It'll be seasoned so it'll taste and smell even better than what you get with regular cattle. Think about how many times have you gone to a restaurant and bit into something, you get a piece of cartilage or a piece of bone or something in it. So 10, 15, 20 years from now, for all the people that really care about animals like I do, anybody that has a conscience or a heart, look at the way that we treat animals, and it's just fucking absolutely horrendous, and it's cruel. It's not a nice thing to do, and with the way technology is advancing, we're going to be able to grow all that stuff and have little warehouses in the city. And so if you've been following what Amazon's been doing with their drone delivery and other things, literally you can go on your computer in a couple clicks, order whatever plants or food you need, and a little drone and come and drop it on your doorstep or on your balcony if you happen to live in a high rise or something like that. And you literally will be getting food, especially when it comes to plants, that was just cut and trimmed a matter of a half hour ago before it gets to your front door. Because especially when it comes to plants, it's like once they're cut, you got the distribution networks. Sometimes you're getting stuff that's a week or two since it's been taken out of the ground. Can you imagine stuff that's like literally minutes after? How much fresher? And for those of you that are juicing vegetables and following the recipe, Corey's green juice, if you've ever bought like a tray of wheatgrass where it's still growing and you cut it and you juice that versus wheatgrass that comes in the bag, the stuff that's in the bag tends to have a much more bitter taste. But when you're cutting the wheatgrass in a tray, it's a lot sweeter. Because as soon as you cut the stuff off, it starts to break down and the nutrients start to break down. So it's exciting from that perspective, from a health and nutrition standpoint. 10, 15, 20 years, people are going to get healthier and healthier food with more of the nutrients in it, which our bodies will be healthier. If you look at Afghanistan, the life expectancy was like 30, 35 years ago, or 30, 35 years just 10, 15 years ago. One of the benefits of obviously the West being involved there, the life expectancy of the average Afghan citizen is 65 years old now. It's doubled in the last 15 years. That's incredible. Just because people have more access to clean water and especially health care. So back to the bullet points. Each state is a country. We're a democratic constitutional republic. We're a union of 50 individual countries. And what the electoral does is that it distributes voting power evenly amongst all the states despite their population sizes. This levels the playing field and prevents one or two states with large concentration of voters such as New York, California, or Texas or Florida, from in essence imposing their will. I mean, when you look at the popular vote, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by, I think it was like 3 or 4 million votes. But if you look at how many people in California voted for Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, I mean, that you got like I think she got 3 or 4 million more votes in California alone. And if we didn't have the Electoral College, you literally could have one state deciding for the whole rest of the country. And that's not fair for other states that happen to be in the middle of the country that aren't going to be as highly populous, but at the end of the day, they're still their own country. And obviously the citizens of Oklahoma or Kansas or any of the states that happen to be kind of in the middle of the country, Missouri, having one state 1,000 miles away basically deciding what the policies are going to be that are going to affect or influence their people. Remember, like attracts like. Birds of a feather flock together. Water seeks its own level. Like attracts like. That's why you see areas, if you've ever looked at the electoral maps, it's so interesting that it doesn't matter what party it is, but you get high concentrations of people that vote a certain way, all living together in certain communities. I mean, you can see that spiritual truth just by the distribution of voters. People who are like-minded tend to live and work together. They're just naturally drawn to one another. So, again, what I think is great about it, and there's been people, we got to get rid of the Electoral College, and it's been this way since our founding. That's the way it was. I mean, who knows, 50, 100 years from now, I mean, if you look back over the last 100 years, the makeup of the citizenry tends to change. And for me, obviously, I teach self-reliance, and what I love about the country that I live in, obviously the United States of America, is the number one most important thing that our whole country is based upon is the freedom of the individual. And it doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or you don't believe in any kind of divinity. The bottom line is the way the laws are written is based on the assumption, going back to natural law, that we're in this world, each of us as an individual, because it is the will of the Creator, whether you believe in a Creator or not. It's automatically assumed that it is the Lord's will that you live here, and therefore you are granted rights from the Creator of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not about collective rights. It's about rights of the individual. Fascinating stuff. So if you'd like to talk to me personally or do a coaching session, you can go to my website, click the products tab at the top on any page on my website and book a coaching session. If you haven't got a copy of my book yet, you can either read it for free on my website by subscribing to the newsletter, and if you like what you're reading, you can also get a free copy of the Audible version just by signing up for a free trial at audible.com. And I will talk to you soon.